On this Wednesday night, what goes up is still going up. The Bank of Canada hikes its trend-setting interest rate again, this time to its highest level in 22 years.
If we don't do enough now, we'll likely have to do even more later.
The questions about whether this is the wisest strategy for Canadians. Supporting Ukraine, the G7's new commitments, and what Canada is pledging. Scandal rocks the BBC, the allegations taking down one of Britain's biggest journalists. And a roadmap to 37 trillion human cells.
We think this process will never really end.
The mission to build the world's largest reference book.
Global National with Dawna Friesen.
Good evening and thanks for joining us. Canada's central bank has raised its benchmark interest rate once again, increasing borrowing costs for Canadians and signaling more financial pain ahead for those carrying a lot of debt. After hitting a pause in January, the central bank resumed its historic rate hiking last month and again today with a 25 basis point hike. This is the 10th increase to Canada's key lending rate since March of last year, pushing it to 5%. The last time it was this high was in April of 2001.
Higher interest rates are needed to slow the growth of demand in the economy and relieve price pressures. We continue to expect economic growth to moderate and inflation to ease, but this will take longer than we forecast in January and April.
Now, this rate hike was highly anticipated, though the economy is performing better than most forecasters had predicted, and there are questions about the central bank's approach and whether it's the right one. Mackenzie Gray has our top story tonight.
We are certainly trying. He's the bearer of bad news yet again. Tiff Macklem raising rates for the 10th time in 16 months.
We know that if we don't do enough now, we'll likely have to do even more later.
The Bank of Canada increasing their key interest rate to 5%, blaming inflation that's stubbornly high. Gone are the days of 8.1% from last summer, but the bank's 2% target is still far off.
Our own forecast has inflation hovering around 3% for the next year, and then coming down gradually to the 2% target in the middle of 2025.
My amortization went up by about 9 years.
The rising rates hitting Zohaib Sheikh hard. He's needing to cut back on his spending to make increased payments on his variable rate mortgage.
The rates are like over 6% right now, and due to that interest rate increase, I have like about approximately $600 increase in my monthly mortgage payments.
Those higher monthly payments caused by the rate hike run-up are now one of the biggest drivers of inflation. The current 3.4% inflation rate drops to 2.5%, right in the bank's target when the impact of mortgage interest costs is taken out, leading some economists to believe the latest hike wasn't needed.
The bank's own research tells us it takes 18 to 24 months for the full impact of interest rate changes to impact the economy, which means we're only just starting to see the impact of their first rate hikes.
Even as those effects are felt, the bank still believes that Canadian house prices will continue to increase.
We've had very strong immigration and temporary foreign workers arriving in the country. So, all those households need somewhere to live.
There is some good news. The bank is still predicting a so-called soft landing, where inflation gets to 2% with no recession. But as for further hikes, Dawna, Tiff Macklem says the bank is willing to send rates higher if needed.
Okay, Mackenzie Gray, we'll keep watching. Thanks. A quick note on inflation in the United States. It has fallen to the lowest it's been in 2 years. The U.S. Labor Department puts the annual inflation rate for June at 3%, down from 4% in May, and the lowest it's been in the U.S. since March of 2021. The U.S. Federal Reserve chose not to raise its benchmark interest rate last month, holding it steady in a range of 5 to 5.2%. With me from Ottawa is Armine Yalnizyan, economist and Atkinson Fellow on the Future of Workers. Armine, the intent of the Bank of Canada raising the key interest rate is to cool inflation, and we've had multiple increases over the past year. Inflation has shown signs of cooling. So why raise rates? Do you see the wisdom in doing that?
I personally don't see the wisdom in doing that. And there's a growing consensus amongst mainstream economists, both former chief economists at central banks like the Bank of England and people on Wall Street saying exactly the same thing that I'm just about to say to you, which is getting from 3 to 2% seems like an awful lot of pain for very little gain, and will have long-term scarring impacts on both individuals and economic potential for the economy. So do we really need to get to 2% quite as quickly if this is just a matter of months? The bank would say it's an insurance policy. If we focus on 2% and get there as fast as we can, any upside unpleasant surprises will prevent us from going back into an era where we have to crank up rates again. So, it's in the eye of the beholder whether that's a good idea or a bad idea.
What is the potential long-term impact on Canadians, especially people who have, variable rate mortgages and lines of credit?
Well, we are seeing the commercial banks actually softening the blow for some people by extending amortization to 60, 70, 80 years, not in perpetuity, but for a little while so that people can adjust to the rate increases. So that's another thing that a central bank can do, is to extend its time horizon. So the ding for rising rates might not be quite as harsh as we might have otherwise expected, but do expect to see more people unable to hang on and will try and turn to sell, particularly condos in this market. And that should normally reduce the price of condos, except the price of everything has gone up. So we don't know what kind of price adjustment will happen in the market. The first 6 months of 2023, housing prices did fall, but now they're up again. So that's partly because we've poured in a lot of people into the economy. More than 1 million people have come into Canada in the last year, and that means there's more demand for housing. Just as, households that do have extra properties have pulled them off of rental markets into short-term rental markets to make more money to cover the costs. So we're actually bleeding more affordable rental housing out of the market than we're building. And that's a real problem. That's cranking up rental rates.
And Armine, let me ask about the big banks. We know they're very profitable. They hiked their prime rates to 7.2% today. Why is that automatic? Do they have to do that and raise their mortgage rates every time the Bank of Canada raises its rate?
That is the way the system is supposed to function. The central bank raises its overnight lending rate for the banks that borrow from one another overnight to settle their accounts. And those banks just push through those costs to the whole cascade of other borrowing costs. And that's exactly why when a central bank raises its rates, it's designed to make borrowing more expensive for everybody. It starts with the banks themselves and cascades through. But you are absolutely right. The banks have never been more profitable, so it's a bit difficult to swallow.
All right, economist Armine Yalnizyan, thank you.
My pleasure.
There is a development today on the BC port strike that's gone on for 12 days. Canada's Labour Minister has stepped in, asking a federal mediator to give the union and the employer a recommendation of a settlement. Both sides, who are blaming each other for not reaching a deal, have until tomorrow morning to respond. As Neetu Garcha reports, the economic impact of this strike is growing by the hour.
The 12th day of the BC port strike began like every other for these workers, with more picketing. But this time, their union and their employer have a settlement offer in front of them with a deadline to accept or reject.
Clearly, a sincere effort by the minister to have this settled between the parties rather than through legislation.
On Tuesday, Labour Minister Seamus O'Regan directed the mediators to draft terms for a settlement. The minister said, as a result of the hard work by the parties at the bargaining table, there is a good deal within reach. With 24 hours to respond, the two sides were given the settlement terms around 10:30 Wednesday morning, the same time business groups held this news conference in Vancouver, demanding an end to the port shutdown.
We are calling on the federal government and the opposition parties to be ready to pass back-to-work legislation if mediation is unsuccessful.
We are seeing a slowdown in our operations and a shutdown starting this week.
If this goes on for a few more weeks, this is going to cost us $150,000 to $200,000 in sales.
Small businesses like this beverage company in Abbotsford, BC, with cargo stuck at the port, also called for more action to get the goods flowing again.
We can't fill our orders to, major retailers that you shop at every day. So it affects the 12 people that work here. And we're a small family business. It's a huge deal for us.
Port workers in the U.S. refused to unload Canadian-bound cargo in solidarity with their Canadian counterparts. About 7,500 BC port workers walked off the job on July 1st. Key issues include automation, cost of living, and outside contracting. Both sides blaming each other for failing to reach a deal. Neetu Garcha, Global News, Vancouver.
The high-stakes NATO summit wrapped up in Lithuania today with the war in Ukraine front and center. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky was there too. His country isn't part of the alliance, but he is pushing hard for membership. Zelensky did not get what he came for, but he did meet with top leaders, including the American President Joe Biden. In a tweet, Zelensky said he had a very good, powerful meeting, and it was at least twice as long as planned, and it was as meaningful as it needed to be. There was progress, and as David Akin reports from Vilnius, leaders including Prime Minister Justin Trudeau say they're prepared to offer Ukraine long-term security guarantees.
The first meeting Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky had as he arrived at the NATO summit was a one-on-one meeting with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau.
All of us, all our feeling that really Canadians helped Ukraine and helped from the very beginning of full-scale war. We really count on you people, and we are the same, and you know that we fight for the same values.
Canada may not have all the wealth or weapons that Ukraine wants, but because of Canada's special relationship with Ukraine, Trudeau can be Ukraine's advocate and ally where Ukraine has no official voice, at NATO, at the G7, the G20, and so on. And then Trudeau can provide Zelensky with counsel and advice.
There is not much debate at home about standing with Ukraine with everything necessary for as long as necessary.
Zelensky came to Vilnius hoping for Ukraine's quick entry into NATO. He did not get that, but he did get some weapons packages he wanted, missiles from France, air defense systems from Germany, and more munitions from the U.S. He also got a commitment from G7 leaders for long-term security guarantees.
Ukrainian delegation is bringing home significant security victory for the Ukraine, for our country, for our people, for our children.
The details of those security guarantees are still to be worked out, but the G7 believes the commitment sends a message to the Kremlin.
I think it's a powerful statement of our commitment to Ukraine as it defends its freedom today and as it rebuilds the future.
Vladimir Putin wants to wait out and grind down the alliance, grind down Ukrainians. Well, he's not going to be able to, because we will be there for as long as it takes. And that's what these security assurances are all about.
Canada also announced some new programs for Ukraine. Canadians will train Ukrainian air crew to maintain and operate F-16 fighter jets, and Canadians will host and train Ukrainian officer cadets at Royal Military College Saint-Jean in Quebec. Dawna.
Okay, David Akin in Vilnius, Lithuania tonight. Thanks. People in 2 flood-ravaged regions are surveying the destruction tonight. How the forecast in Quebec is looking better than what's in store for the U.S. state of Vermont. That's coming up. You can see from these satellite pictures what parts of Vermont and New York look like before and after the intense flooding this week. Heavy rain slammed the northeastern United States, and while the water is starting to recede, the crisis is not over. More rain is forecast later this week. Jackson Prosco reports on the cleanup and how people are bracing for what's still to come.
A thick layer of mud coats everything.
Careful.
After floodwaters surged into stores and homes in Vermont's capital.
The water must have just upended all of this.
The disaster inundated Montpelier, leaving behind tens of millions of dollars in damage.
The cleanup is major, so there's a lot of, it's traumatizing to some degree.
People who survived the rushing waters are shaken.
Just realizing that you had water up to here was absolutely insane. And it's really unlike any other event I've ever lived through.
Though much of the water has receded, the risk is far from over. The ground is saturated, the river's still swollen, and there's more heavy rain in the forecast.
We have to continue to be vigilant and mindful that more flooding is a very real possibility.
This once-in-a-generation flood offers a stark warning about a changing climate, where warmer, more humid weather fuels flash flood events. Areas that once seemed safe may no longer be.
I think everybody needs to sort of pay attention to their environment and their landscape as we learn about these additional changes that are going on in the atmosphere itself, because they all need to sort of come together.
It's the community that's coming together in the flood zone as Vermonters survey the damage.
It's just heartbreaking to see it.
it's going to take so long to get back to where it was.
As the floodwaters recede for now, they've left behind worry about what the future may bring. Jackson Prosco, Global News.
Floodwaters have receded enough in parts of southern Quebec now for many people to return home. The mayor of St. Brigitte de Laval says river levels have stabilized there and everyone should be home by tomorrow. Days of torrential rain flooded properties and damaged roads. About 250 homes were evacuated earlier this week. The province says financial aid will be available for those affected. In British Columbia, a fiery crash has closed the Trans-Canada Highway in both directions just west of Revelstoke. Multiple first responders were called to the scene this afternoon. BC Emergency Health Services say paramedics cared for 5 patients at the scene and took 3 to the hospital. Police at the scene tell Global News 2 people have died. There's no detour around the crash and no estimated time for the highway to reopen. Still ahead, the allegations surrounding one of the BBC's best-known journalists. The RCMP's Major Crimes Unit is investigating at least 70 cases of alleged sexual assault at a provincially run youth detention facility in Nova Scotia. RCMP say the suspected assaults happened at the facility in Waterville between 1988 and 2017, and that the majority of survivors are male who were between the ages of 12 and 18 at the time. Investigators have spoken to 70 people as part of Operation Headwind. They believe more than 200 may be involved. A confidential hotline has been set up to encourage people to come forward with any information related to the investigation. In the UK, a prominent news anchor at the BBC has been named as the person at the center of a tabloid newspaper story about allegations of payments for sexually explicit images.
Buckingham Palace has announced the death of Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II.
From announcing the death of the Queen to elections and anchoring the flagship newscast, 61-year-old Hugh Edwards has been a big part of every story for the BBC for decades. Last week, the Sun newspaper claimed a BBC anchor had paid a teenager £35,000 for explicit photographs. It didn't name Edwards, but today his wife did, issuing a statement saying Hugh is suffering from serious mental health issues. He has been treated for severe depression in recent years, she says, and is now receiving inpatient hospital care. The BBC had suspended Edwards and referred the matter to the police, who have since concluded there was no evidence of a criminal offense. And the Sun newspaper now insists it never meant to imply anything illegal took place and says it has no plans to publish further allegations. Czech-born novelist and essayist Milan Kundera, one of the biggest names in European literature, has died at the age of 94. Kundera became an international sensation with his 1984 novel, The Unbearable Lightness of Being. He investigated themes of exile, memory, and love, and intertwined tragic tales with satirical portrayals of life under communist oppression. Kundera became a leading intellectual dissident, opposing the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia and eventually fleeing for France in 1975. He was stripped of his Czech citizenship and his books were banned there until the Velvet Revolution of 1989. He spent much of his later life in seclusion. Ambitious Atlas next, the efforts to create an unprecedented reference book of the human body. The Canadian Food Inspection Agency tells Global News it will recall a highly caffeinated energy drink promoted by popular YouTube stars. Prime Energy contains 200 milligrams of caffeine per can, exceeding Health Canada's allowable limit of 180 milligrams. The agency says it is aware the beverage is being sold in some Canadian stores without approval and is actively working to address the issue. Hundreds of scientists from around the world have come together in Toronto to work on an ambitious goal, mapping every cell in the human body. They want to create the biggest reference book ever and make it accessible to health experts everywhere. Catherine Ward explains why they're doing it and what difference it could make.
Everyone's coming together to figure out how to put it all together.
The liver, the heart, the pancreas. Every cell is up for discussion as more than 3,000 people from around the world work to create the largest reference book on the planet.
The human body has over 37 trillion cells on average, and we don't know a lot about what most of these cells do. And so we're mapping those to find out where they all are and discover new ones as well.
It's called the Human Cell Atlas, a project that started in 2016.
It's thought that even very rare populations of cells can drive disease.
Gary Bader and Sonia McParland are part of the Canadian team helping to map the liver.
By figuring out where all these cells live in the human body, scientists are hopeful this will help with more targeted treatments.
It's already proving its worth.
We've learned that there's multiple populations in the liver that can either promote regeneration, so tissue repair, or they can promote things like transplant rejection. It raises the possibility that you could reprogram a liver to be less likely to reject.
Bader says the atlas helped with another breakthrough, a new type of cell discovered in the lung. It carries the gene for cystic fibrosis.
We can now know where cystic fibrosis is acting in the lung, and we can start understanding how it breaks the lung in that genetic disease.
Experts say this is a book that will be written for many years to come.
We think this process will never really end. It will always be iterative. We'll always be kind of working more towards really understanding health and then disease.
Catherine Ward, Global News, Toronto.
And that is Global National for this Wednesday. I'm Dawna Friesen. Tonight's Your Canada takes you well beyond our country to the birth of stars. This breathtaking photo from the James Webb Space Telescope shows dozens of stars at the moment of birth. NASA says all of them are similar to the sun's mass or smaller. The image was released to mark the first anniversary of the James Webb Space Telescope. Thanks for watching. Hope to see you here again tomorrow. Bye-bye.